When people think about ways that politicians go about manipulating elections for their favor, the first thing that comes to mind is often election fraud. And this was most likely perpetuated, most especially by the 2020 presidential election between former President Donald Trump and current President Joe Biden. Now, Donald Trump made several allegations to the election, specifically with mail-in ballots, that led him to believe that there was some voter fraud happening and some inflated support for Joe Biden. While these claims were later proven false, the seeds were sown in the dirt, as now many Americans believe that this was a case of voter fraud, especially within Republicans. However, there's one method of political manipulation that is arguably much more significant that most people are not talking about. I'm Scott Pelley, and on tonight's edition of 60 Minutes, we'll be taking an extensive look into none other than gerrymandering. Governor Jerry, can you describe what gerrymandering is for us?
I would define gerrymandering, and many other sources would, as drawing the congressional or state district lines to show in a false representation of an area's political representation for a certain party's gain.
Explain a little bit of the historical context surrounding gerrymandering.
The historical context. The official term was coined after a proposal in 1812 while I was governor of Massachusetts. I came into governor of Massachusetts with a political career before. I was part of the original Constitutional Convention, which I did not sign because of the Bill of Rights, was not included. I would later come on to the first Congress and help pass the Bill of Rights. And eventually I made my way to the governor of Massachusetts after a few failed first attempts. And at that point I had declared myself a Democrat-Republican, and there was a new proposed plan for the redistricting boundaries of Massachusetts, of which I approved. Some people believe that redistricting plan favored the Democrat-Republicans over the Federalists, and it was mocked by some political cartoonists.
In this figure, you can see how gerrymandering is represented visually. So if we look at the far left figure, you can see that blue would be representing Democrats and then red would be representing Republicans. So you can see here we have about 60% Democrats and then 40% Republicans. That's not necessarily the case, but for this representation, that's what we'll be looking at. And we'll see perfect representation in the second to left image, where in each district it's 100% Democrats or 100% Republicans. So we see three blue districts where we'd have three Democratic representatives, and then we'd have two Republican representatives. So there's nothing wrong really with that figure. If you look at the second to right image, that's where things start getting a little bit dicey. So we have 5 districts still, but the Democrats gave themselves a 60% to 40% advantage in every single district. So all the districts are going to flip to Democratic, even if that doesn't represent the population as a whole. And then on the last diagram, we can see that this is the most common technique for gerrymandering, in which we have all these very bizarre patterns. You can see that in some districts, it's almost all Democratic, and that doesn't necessarily seem wrong initially until you look at how Republicans are framing their districts, in which they barely have an advantage over the Democrats. And by doing this, they're actually diluting Democrats' influence in these districts, which does not portray an accurate representation of really what we'll be seeing here. So there's actually going to be 3 red districts and 2 blue districts, which would give the Republicans an unfair advantage over the Democrats. This is something that we see all the time in congressional and state legislative districts.
Okay, so can you tell me a little bit more about the history of gerrymandering and some techniques that gerrymanders use in order to gain a political advantage?
Mm-hmm. Gerrymandering was present in the United States before 1812 when some political cartoonists believe that I did gerrymandering on Massachusetts. Originally, it's believed to be coming from England. There's a term called rotten boroughs, which was used to refer to areas of England with a low voter population upon which politicians could buy the remaining votes of that district to gain a seat in Parliament. And again, it was used slightly before 1812. The situation in Massachusetts was the first real widespread use of gerrymandering, and to the largest extent it had in United States history. So the two methods for gerrymandering that the Democrat Republicans and I implemented was cracking and packing. Now, cracking is literally just cracking up a certain voter population into multiple districts. So in the case where the Democrat Republicans and I wanted to gain a upper hand over the Federalists in Massachusetts, what we implement is where we cracked up the majority of the Federalist voters into multiple districts. So in one case you could give them a district that encompasses a large percent of Federalists, which will give them a majority and a seat in the state legislature. But if we crack them up into 3 districts, then that could put them at a minority to Democrat Republicans in every district, which would prevent them from getting any seats whatsoever in the state legislature for that certain area. On the other hand, we have packing. So packing is where you place voters of a certain group or population into one district, and that might seem counterintuitive to some people. That why would you put all those voters into one district? Because that's pretty much sacrificing a district to the opposing party, which it is true, but in certain cases it's actually beneficial. If there's a large enough percentage of the opposing political party that is truly a threat to your party, you're going to probably want to implement packing, because to a certain point, giving them over a 50% majority in that district is beneficial for that party. Once you keep adding voters of that party to that district past the point of what they need to win it, then you're really gaining success for your own party. Because each voter that you put in the district past the majority that they have, you're diluting the power of all the other districts that they could be have a higher chance of winning had you not packed them into that one district.
So, Mr. Hofeller, would you mind describing your role in the Republican Party today and also your role in redistricting maps throughout the United States today for both state legislatures and also U.S. congressional districts?
Yeah,
I am a political strategist who has worked on redistricting maps in Missouri and Arizona and Ohio and a variety of other states in order to provide the much-needed justice that Republicans haven't received for decades after Democrats have thrown down every political strategy possible in order to gain a political advantage for themselves. And I'm trying to shed light on this and promote democracy throughout the United States. Naturally, state legislatures, they're not completely aware of the needs for, or really how you go about redistricting, so they need to hire professionals or political strategists like myself in order to get that job done and in order to ensure that everyone is fairly represented throughout the United States. So as I've said, I've worked for a variety of different state legislatures in order to make sure this happens. Every time I create a map, it's always passed with flying colors through the state legislature, so my work clearly is justified and what it does is effective for the needs of the United States.
Does every state use you for their drawing lines? Does every state have state legislator hire their own operatives, or are there other methods for states?
Sure.
For creating their own?
There are other methods for going about this. There have been some commissions that have been started in several states, especially like California. But what we found there is that they actually end up using it's not as nonpartisan as they claim it is. There's often Democrats and Republicans on that just continue to quarrel over how the districts are drawn, and this just leads to political stagnation where we're not really getting to any progress in redistricting efforts. So really having these commissions, which is the alternative to what I am doing with my work,
is only working to exacerbate the issue at hand in terms of political representation.
To clarify what Mr. Hofeller is referring to, we look at Ohio's state congressional map. So you can see here that the map is fairly irregular itself, and seeing the fact that Ohio is a swing state, in theory, there should be equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, but in reality, in the House, for instance, there's 64 Republicans and 35 Democrats. And if we go on to look at another example of the Ohio U.S. congressional districts, as we can see right here, we see a very, very similar case where we have there should be about an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, but there are 11 Republicans in the U.S. House and only 3 Democrats, where that should be about 7 and 7. So this is just a prime example of political strategists like Hofeller at work having their state legislatures approve something like this, where we that would give Republicans a significant advantage over Democrats, even if that's not what the political makeup of that state really is.
So, Mr. Hofeller, you were quoted as saying, quote, "I define redistricting as the only legalized form of vote stealing left in the United States today," end quote. Would you mind explaining this quote for us? So what I mean when I say vote stealing is that we're just giving back the votes, the rightful votes, to the Republicans that were stolen essentially from us by the Democrats. And if we see throughout history, there have been consistent resurgences in Republican support, especially after, like with the Bush administration, and especially after the crash of 2008 and the recession there. That just gives back a lot of support back to the Republicans, where where people in the United States are looking for someone to actually represent this country and actually represent or shed light on the fiscal issues that really need to be solved with conservative policies. So this absolutely is just giving a more accurate representation of what we need to see here in terms of politicians in U.S. Congress and in state legislatures.
What Mr. Hofeller neglected to inform our interviewer is just the fact that to the extent to which that he has gone in order to make sure that Republicans get this alleged representation that they need throughout the United States. As you can see here, these districts are clearly manipulated in a way that would give an advantage to the Republicans. You can see how narrow some strips are and how it almost seems like they disconnect in some areas. And how they just wrap around certain districts in order just to give that ideal ratio of Republicans to Democrats.
Mr. Hofeller, last question here. Would you mind describing the allegations that your political opponents have made in terms of your role in misconstruing the meaning of majority-minority districts and how you'd respond to that? Sure. So I think my strategy in having these majority-minority districts is really just to provide a more accurate representation of what we're seeing politically in the United States. So I'll give you a scenario here. So say we had in each district, it was directly representative of like the demographic of the United States as a whole. So if we go with that strategy, I mean, it's as simple as having a few political campaigns that really inspire like high voter turnouts among younger generations that tend to be Democratic. And since like the political breakdown in the United States is very, very close between Democrats and Republicans, is pretty close to 50-50, all it could take is just a few campaigns where we're inspiring voter turnout, and then all of a sudden Democrats have ultimate control of all these districts, and that's not representative of all the political beliefs of the country. So my strategy in having these majority-minority districts is to pack a few minorities in a few districts and give them their districts that represents them, and then the other districts are going to be Republican districts that represents their beliefs. So then we're having both ideologies represented in both state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress. So really, I'm not breaking any laws here. All I'm trying to do is just ensure justice for both political parties and ensure that one party doesn't override the interests of another in a state legislature. Can you tell me a little bit about the research that you've done with Stephanie Hofeller and what she's done to uncover her father's very questionable political dealings?
Well, after her father's death, before her father's death, she had been removed from her family. After her father's death, she had gotten into contact with her mother. And upon coming back to her childhood home, she discovered 18 maps that Thomas Hofeller had created during his time alive. She turned these into a political advocacy group, which then had some of the maps overturned in North Carolina.
Okay.
So, the maps show that Thomas Hofeller had some questionable dealings, all in all. There was some data showing that he had troves of data that were taken on stuff such as college students, their ethnicity, their race, their political orientation, and as much as Hofeller and others can try to argue that it was all for a common good, the fact that you would need to take such detailed notes shows you're trying to undermine the system of American democracy.
In the figure below, you can see Dale Oldham, who is a co-worker of Thomas Hofeller. And then in their time together, all the maps that they ended up creating and everything they did with all these surveys and all these demographic information gatherings were sealed in documents and were deemed trade secrets by these two men. And despite all attempts by Geographic Strategies, which is the company that the two formed, in keeping these documents sealed, they were ultimately opened up due to the efforts of Stephanie Hofeller. And there are still ongoing attempts to subpoena Dale Oldham, considering the fact that Hofeller is deceased as of 2018.
Chief Justice Roberts, would you mind describing a few of the decisive court cases from the 1960s to present in regards to gerrymandering?
Yeah, so with regards to gerrymandering, one of the first important cases would be Westbury v. Sanders in 1964, where the court basically, Earl Warren's court basically affirmed that one person, one vote with regards to extremely malapportioned districts in certain states, because there's different districts that had vastly more people than other ones, and that was obviously declared unconstitutional. More recently, in the 80s, the big one was Thornburg v. Ingalls, where the court basically ruled that majority-minority districts were constitutional and they were very much should be a part of United States redistricting in the future. And that's kind of led into a lot of the big cases today where it's just controversies over the redistricting of certain states with regards a lot of times to political parties.
Chief Justice Roberts, can you also describe for me how the court's stance on gerrymandering has changed from the 1960s all the way to present?
Of course. So in the 60s, the Voting Rights Act and stuff, that basically outlawed racial gerrymandering. And since then, there's been an absolute no stance on racial gerrymandering to disenfranchise black voters. Partisan gerrymandering is currently a hotly debated topic, and it can definitely occur, but a lot of times it's very hard to tell. Is this racial gerrymandering? Is it just an accident? And the Supreme Court does have the power to declare a case or a certain thing unconstitutional if it does fall under the category of partisan gerrymandering, but that's pretty rare, and a lot of times the Supreme Court will not rule on that as much or defer to a state court or something.
So in everything that we've learned today, it's clear that nonpartisan commissions are not the only way to solve this issue, and in fact cannot be solely used in order to solve the issue of gerrymandering. So can you two tell me a little bit about some other solutions that can be used in compound with nonpartisan commissions to solve this problem?
So one of the best solutions, I think, is just changing the voting system entirely. It's kind of, and it would maybe even get rid of the nonpartisan commissions even, and that would be ranked choice voting, or instant runoff voting. There's a lot of different things in there, but the general idea of ranked choice voting would be voters would rank whoever they want on their ballot. Like there'd be maybe 5 say options, and you just rank 1 through 5 who you want. Those votes would then get counted, and then you have to hit a certain mark, say 50%, to win. And if the candidate doesn't hit that, you would eliminate the lowest number, and then put their votes into their second choice, and then keep doing that until someone has 50%. And that's just a great way of really finding who has the majority there. And this would sort of get rid of the motive for gerrymandering, and in that there'd be no more wasted vote effect where voters would continue voting past what they would need to win. So you wouldn't have districts where packed districts where it's like 70-80% would go to Democrats or 70-80% would go to Republicans. There'd be no more really wasted vote, as people would vote whoever they feel is the best candidate. And this would be a pretty powerful solution, and I think it might be one of the best ways. And even though it would be a big step, I think it would be worth taking.
Okay. All right. I mean, there's obviously more solutions. There's the efficiency gap, which is a statistical tool that measures the amount of excess voters in districts to try to prevent packing cases. There's the Pools v. Popper test, which measures the area of the object of the district one's looking at to the area of a circle with the same perimeter as the area you're looking at, to compare to see how much the jagged the lines are, that it's not too irregular in its shape. And I mean, there's a plethora of other statistical reasonings and methods to try to combat the method of gerrymandering, but these methods shouldn't be considered the end-all and be-all of the case. I mean, gerrymandering is a complex issue that's caused problems for decades in American history. And, I mean, the requirements to have similar populations and the uneven population distributions among states will always make districting not an easy task. There's so many requirements in it today that it's never going to be easy. But I think with the right amount of mixing of tools, such as the efficiency gap, nonpartisan committees, and if the Supreme Court starts looking at some of these methods with more legitimacy, I think the problem can be better combated than it is today in America.
So can you describe for me what a nonpartisan commission is in terms of redistricting, and also how they've been used abroad in countries especially like Australia?
Well, nonpartisan commission for redistricting, at least, it's basically a group of people who redraw the districts for a certain area that are not doing it for one party. Say, it's not like a Republican redrawing the districts for the Republican Party. It's a group of Republicans and Democrats drawing it, like a bipartisan group, or it's a group independent of political parties, just independents redrawing it, just to make it fair and equal for everybody. And in Australia, they had a system like this, but the committees were not equally represented for parties. So one party ended up, and this is in the early 90s, one party ended up with more people on the commission than they should have had, and this led to gerrymandering and other problems. So then this got repealed, and it was scaled back basically. And today, now, the system is kind of a mess now. The commissions aren't really doing their job properly, and that's just largely because they don't have the legislation now making it so that these are equal and even. And I think that's the biggest takeaway is that commissions need to be even. They need to represent fairly all the political parties involved, and they need to represent the voters that are in the district that they're doing their commission for.
So, coming back to the sphere of the United States, could you talk to me about the differences between a legislature redrawing the districts and in terms of the political breakdowns in their state legislatures compared to a commission composed of Democrats and Republicans, or just of all independents, headed by some sort of independent in a state that is also a swing state, and also the political breakdown of their respective state legislature?
Well, I think two obvious examples you can go to on this matter is Florida and Arizona. From the 2020 election, we saw that they had very similar makeups, very, very tight between Biden and Trump on who they were going to elect. And while Florida was, I'd say, a little more securely in the Republican Party, they both have differing they have different methods of drawing the lines. Florida is a legislator-heavy or dominant system, so the state legislator will be able to have a direct influence on that, while Arizona is based off a commission. And I think it definitely shows when you look in the state legislator makeup, the difference. I mean, while the Republicans do hold a advantage in Florida, it is disproportionate to the amount of actual voters they had voting for Donald Trump compared to Biden. While in Arizona, a swing state that went blue this year, they were very equal. And of course, presidential elections, not everyone voted. It's not going to show the truly accurate Republican and Democrat support groups for each state, but I think it gives you the disproportionate Republican power in Florida, can give you a sense of the problem with state legislators drawing the lines. And, some people in some opposition will argue that no one is truly nonpartisan, and I mean that is correct. No one will be truly unbiased in the problem, but just pointing to the fact that everyone is biased is not going to solve the problem. I mean, time and time again, you have examples from Thomas Hofeller. It's just state legislators drawing the lines themselves it's not going to solve the problem. I mean, it's gerrymandering after gerrymandering from each party. I think you're going to have to go down to a commission. Will the commission be perfect? No, but I think if you put the systems right in the systems through which you elect, the accountability system, and other verification tests, I think you can get a system that is significantly improved from what is present in the United States today.
Thank you for tuning in to another edition of 60 Minutes. If you're interested in learning more about gerrymandering, please head up to our website at www.60minutes.com in order to access some additional resources. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time on another edition of 60 Minutes.